During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone by automobile through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of the evening drew on, within view of my destination. Greetings, Poe fans, and welcome back to our degree episode of Jeanie. What are we talking about tonight?
Well, we must be talking about horror because I'm feeling a little psycho tonight.
And joining us as a co host for this horror episode is Dr. Jeff Thompson. Welcome.
Yay!
Hello. Nice to see you.
Yes.
How are you doing, Jeanie and Carmen?
Doing well.
Good.
Yeah, doing better every day, thank God.
And we're happy to have you on with us. So we're going to just jump right in, and as people can see if they are watching, we have Robert Bloch as our feature to speak of tonight, and there's a picture behind me, and he's actually reading his book, Psycho. So, Jeanie, do you want to start, or Dr. Jeff, do you want to start?
No, I'll give us a kickoff here, and since I'll kick it off a little bit with what I know, so that will run right into where Jeff can just, give us the Robert Bloch we all know and love.
Yes.
So one of the things with Robert Bloch, I know one nice little tidbit about the three of us is that one of the ways that we met Dr. Jeff was we had gone to this movie night at one of our local Cineplex. It's called Full Moon Cineplex.
Mm-hmm.
And they have this wonderful thing where they play, like, is it every Saturday and Friday night or just every Friday night, Dr. Jeff? I can't remember.
Usually Friday nights.
Yeah.
And
So
one
like
or two movies.
Yeah, like on Friday night. So this Friday night, Carmen and I, because Carmen said, hey, look, they're playing Psycho. Let's go see. And so I'm like, oh, I'm down with that. So we show up, and then the guy who hosts it, help me with his name, Dr. Jeff.
Ben Dixon.
Yes, Ben Dixon. Carmen and I had been talking to him, and we'd been talking about our podcast. And he said, oh, then you need to meet Dr. Jeff. Because he does Dark Shadows. He has his own podcast and everything. I'm like, oh, we're down with it. And so a little bit of background of that's how the three of us met. And so it was like a psycho tie because Robert Bloch was our introduction to each other. And it was wonderful that night because for me, it'd been a long time since I'd watched the movie, much less read the book. And to see it once again on the big screen and just to get that psychological, this is one of the things I love about the name Psycho, because we've always discussed this, that one of the things that I love about Edgar Allan Poe is his psychological writing. So Robert Bloch, I think that's one thing that always made me attach him with Poe was because of the psychological, messing of the plots and the people and everything like that. So I know Robert Bloch definitely wrote more than just Psycho. So that's where I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Jeff, because many people may not know the writer behind him other than just he wrote Psycho. So if you'll help us out and just give us really Robert Bloch and who he truly was, not just the man behind Psycho.
Yes. Robert Bloch wrote novels and short stories, many of which were made into radio dramas or TV episodes or movies. One of his most famous short stories is Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper. Which was made into an episode of Boris Karloff's Thriller and a couple of radio adaptations. Robert Bloch was fascinated with Jack the Ripper and wrote several stories about the Ripper or a Ripper-type character, and I guess you could count the killer in Psycho as such. And he also wrote TV shows. One of his episodes of Star Trek is Wolf in the Fold, which is about a Ripper-like spirit that possesses somebody on a planet. And Bloch tries to explain how Jack the Ripper was more than just one person. It was an entity that maybe showed up in Cleveland, Ohio in the 1930s or other places where there were unsolved killings, and maybe even is in outer space. But Robert
Mhm.
Bloch wrote some Star Trek episodes, The Girl from Uncle, the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, and quite a few others. And then many of his stories were adapted to movies. Asylum, a
Mhm.
great one, and Torture Garden. And that one includes a dramatization of his story, The Man Who Collected Poe. And
Mhm.
that is one of several connections that we can talk about. Um,
Absolutely.
Robert Bloch wrote novels such as The Kidnapper, a crime drama,
Mhm.
The Scarf, American Gothic, which is all about the serial killer at the Chicago World's Fair, a true
Mhm.
story. And
Mhm.
nonfiction books have been written about that also. Oh, he wrote a novel called Lori, Lori, which
Right.
deals with split personalities. And just as Jack the Ripper is a trademark of Bloch's work, so definitely is the idea of a split personality, dissociative identity disorder. We see
Mhm.
Mhm.
that in his most famous novel, and in the book Lori, and in several of his short stories. Lucy Comes to Stay, which was made into a movie adaptation, and Enoch, Enoch, and several others that deal with, a split personality. So that's another topic that he was fascinated with. But according to his wonderful autobiography, Once Around the Block, Bloch, as in
Great name and pun.
Yeah.
from 1993, Mr. Bloch said that growing up, he read the works of Mark Twain, Edgar Allan Poe, Nathaniel
Mhm.
Hawthorne, O. Henry, Sir Walter Scott, Washington Irving, Guy de Maupassant, and others. And of course, he was friends with H.P. Lovecraft, the early 20th century horror writer, who definitely is a bridge from Poe to Lovecraft to Robert Bloch and Richard Matheson, and
Mhm.
then to Stephen King, Anne Rice, Clive Barker, and all of the current horror writers. Um, but Bloch was a teenager and wrote a fan letter to H.P. Lovecraft, and they began writing back and forth to each other. I believe until Lovecraft died, and I think that's one reason why Robert Bloch appreciated and tolerated and accepted fans so well. Some people don't want to deal with fans or fool with them, but Robert
Mhm.
Bloch was always very, very appreciative of his readers and his fans. And whenever he appeared at conventions like Famous Monsters in 1993 or the very first World Horror Convention here in Nashville in 1991, he was very friendly, very patient, very accessible. And I
Mhm.
believe that's because he knew what it meant to be a fan and to love a famous writer, because that's what he had done as a teenager. And Lovecraft was fond of him too, and even used him as a character in one of Lovecraft's stories. He renamed him Robert Blake before
Oh, cool.
that name was famous.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But that character, who I believe dies in the story, is based on Robert Bloch. And another story about the fans that I have told on another podcast is that one time, years after Bloch was the Robert Bloch and famous and Psycho and everything had come out, some fans wrote to him and said, "Mr. Bloch, we have a fanzine, and would you write an article for our fanzine?" And so
Mhm.
he did.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, you know, uh, he was a best-selling author of science fiction, fantasy, and horror, but he took the time to
Mhm.
write a little article and just gave it to these fans to put into their fanzine.
That's neat.
I knew Robert Bloch for the last 4 years of his life. He died in 1994, but in 1990, I began corresponding with him. And
Okay.
he was very, very nice. You know, he writes stories of grisly murders and mayhem and horror, but he was really a very kind, gentle, considerate, um,
Mhm.
everyday person in real life. Um, I always typed my letters to him, but he always wrote back to me by hand in a felt
Oh.
tip pen, either blue, black, or red.
Mhm.
And we did talk about his work, of course, and I would write to him and tell him which stories were my favorite of his, like The Pen and The Goddess of Wisdom and Till Death Do Us Part. I was
Mhm.
reading his 3-volume collected short stories of Robert Bloch at the time, and I would mention to him the ones I really liked. But but that wasn't all that we wrote about. Most of what we wrote about was just our families, our travels, our work,
Mhm.
my work at Tennessee State University and WAMB Radio, and
Mhm.
whatever his latest, book or publication or something was about to come out. And we talked about Psycho briefly. Um, he never watched. He of course saw the movie Psycho, but he never watched the sequels. He never watched them. He wasn't interested because he had written his own sequels. He wrote a book called Psycho 2, which has
Mhm.
nothing to do with the great, great movie Psycho 2,
Mhm.
1983. Uh,
Okay.
in his novel Psycho 2, the main character dies. Bloch kills him off, and then he wrote another novel called Psycho House. So
Okay.
he did his own thing, with Psycho after the movie. But
Mhm.
he did tell me that he thought that Psycho was a very good movie, and his only quibble or drawback or complaint with it is that he felt that the scene with Simon Oakland as a psychiatrist at the end went on too long.
Oh,
Mhm.
interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
that was his only
Mhm.
negative comment, but he said that the movie was excellent, and
Mhm.
many fans have said that. But to be fair, the corresponding scene in Bloch's novel Psycho
Uh-huh.
goes on quite a while with the psychiatrist explaining things, and I think for back then, 1960, when the movie came out,
Mhm.
people knew about split personalities. They, of course, had read Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and seen the movie The Three Faces of Eve. But
Mhm.
the idea of a split personality was not ingrained into our public consciousness the way it is now, because after all of these years, every soap opera has done a split personality story, and
Absolutely.
all of the nighttime cop shows have done split personalities, and Trilogy of Terror, the Richard Matheson stories that Dan Curtis directed, that aired 51 years ago tonight on ABC.
Oh.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh,
Trilogy of
cool.
Terror deals with a split personality. So now, at this late date, we've seen it all. We know all about split personalities. But in 1960, it was still an unusual idea, and so I think that the audiences of that time needed such a tutorial, a long explanation to make sure that they really got what was going on and what was
Mhm.
happening and what was in his mind and what caused him to be this way. He was always bad.
Yes.
Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, so we talked about Psycho just a little bit, but he was more interested in talking about what he was doing at the moment. He was collaborating with a couple of other writers, and
Okay.
things like that. And in his autobiography, he mentions going to visit some Poe sites. Um,
Okay.
this was in the 1980s, but he says several years after the trip to Lovecraft's Providence, Rhode Island, I
Hmm.
found myself in Poe's Baltimore, visiting his home and his churchyard grave. I was surprised to find both residences so small. He had lived here in what was scarcely more than a doll's house, and he rested now within a tiny tract surrounded by the surge of the city. One does not think of Edgar Allan Poe as a little man. I said that he rested now in his grave, but of course Poe doesn't rest. Like Lovecraft, he remains alive within his work, and neither man needs a pyramid to preserve his memory in stone. For better or worse, writers build their own monuments.
Oh, that's very well said.
Yeah, that was nice, and it's true. My TSU colleague, Dr. Jonathan Lampley, and I went to the FanX horror convention in Baltimore in the late 1990s and early 2000s. And so every year when we were in Baltimore, we visited Poe's grave. And it is interesting that it is in a small graveyard beside a church, which is now in downtown Baltimore with all of the tall buildings growing up
Yeah.
all around it. You know, I'm sure when he was buried, it was a bucolic pastoral site,
Hmm.
but now, it's right in the middle of the city. So it's very interesting to visit. And then there's a Poe House in Baltimore, and the football team is called the Ravens. So, and you can find little souvenirs and stuff around town. So that's nice.
Absolutely.
But
Yeah, it is.
but speaking of um, well, before I mention that, I want to mention, well, I'll go back and talk about The Man Who Collected Poe, a
Okay.
story that is dramatized in the movie Torture Garden. And if you I definitely read that story. I want you to read that, everybody, but don't stop there, because if you read that one story, you don't get an idea of what Robert Bloch is or what his writing style is.
Hmm.
In one of my letters, I called him the Ernest Hemingway of science fiction, fantasy, and horror,
Okay.
because in all of his other stories, his writing is very to the point, very matter of fact, no frills, just
Hmm.
stating the facts and keeping the story moving the way Hemingway and other 20th century modern writers did. But the
Hmm.
way he writes, The Man Who Collected Poe, is in a much more ornate, frilly manner, as if he is writing like a 19th century writer or like Edgar Allan Poe would. So that's
Hmm.
wonderful to see that he was had such good technique that he could put aside his Robert Bloch straightforward style and write as a Poe type writer. But that wasn't the first time he had done that, because um, he finished Poe's unfinished story, The Lighthouse. And
Hmm.
several people, Joyce Carol Oates and several writers, have latched upon that tiny fragment and written stories or made movies about it. But I think Bloch was the first to do it. And let
Hmm.
me read just a couple of paragraphs in his autobiography about that. During
Okay.
1951 and 1952, I wrote very little fiction aside from a few short stories and an unsuccessful effort at a novel, which was published in abbreviated form by Blue Book magazine. One of the short stories was a pastiche titled The Man Who Collected Poe, in which I deliberately inserted sentences taken directly from The Fall of the House of Usher, combining them with my own just to see if anybody would notice. One of the few who did was Professor Thomas Olive Mabbott of Hunter College, who was putting together a collection of Poe stories for publication. In the course of his research, he encountered Poe's final and unfinished tale, The Lighthouse, and wrote to me suggesting that I might complete it. the notion of posthumous collaboration with Edgar Allan Poe was irresistible, particularly since in the event of a sale, I wouldn't have to split the fee with him. It proved quite a challenge to pick up the story where Poe had left off and continue it in such a manner that the reader wouldn't detect any change of style. Poe was considerably more difficult to imitate or emulate than Lovecraft. I kept at it until the result was reasonably seamless, and The Lighthouse found first publication in Fantastic. On the whole, however, writing provided little escape from the vicissitudes of the day. And sure enough, his story, The Lighthouse, was published in the January-February 1953 issue of Fantastic, and
Right.
then in 1969 was reprinted in Famous Monsters of Filmland, number 53, February of 69. And like I say, other writers, Joyce Carol Oates and others, have written off of that fragment, and the recent black and white movie, The Lighthouse,
Yes.
um, started out as the Robert Eggers and his brother wanted to make a more or less faithful adaptation of that fragment of a story, but it
Hmm.
didn't quite work out, and so they went in a different direction. But that movie is, owes its life to The Lighthouse, which is
Hmm.
it's an epistolary story, like Dracula is an epistolary novel told in journal entries, letters,
Hmm.
newspaper reports, things like that. And in The Lighthouse, it's a series of short entries dated January 1, 2, 3, 4, about a man whose new job is the caretaker of a lighthouse, and he's worried that he's so isolated, and a huge storm is coming, and he's afraid that maybe even the lighthouse will collapse under the storm. And then Poe wrote the words January 4, and then that was it. He never finished it. One scholar said, well, maybe that is the end of the story. Maybe the lighthouse fell down and the man died, and that's it.
Oh,
But I don't believe that. I think that Poe,
I agree.
some scholars think it might even was going to be the beginning of a novel. I don't know about that, but definitely a longer short story than the little scrap we have.
Hmm.
But yeah, so that was interesting that Bloch imitated Poe in The Man Who Collected Poe, and he actually continued Poe in The Lighthouse. But he mentions in his book that years later, Harlan Ellison did the same thing with him. Bloch wrote a novel, and it came up about 1,000 words too short for the publisher, and Harlan Ellison worked at the publishing company, or he was the reader or something, and
Hmm.
so Bloch was under the gun writing TV screenplays that had to be done by so and so date. So Harlan Ellison just padded it for him, and he added on to Robert Bloch. So
Oh,
that's
wow.
interesting.
Yeah. Oh, that is. Well, and I noticed too that one of the other things that he did was the Twilight Zone movie in the 80s. He novelized it.
Yes,
I
right.
did not know that. I thought that was really interesting because that movie was definitely well done.
Oh, yes, uh-huh. And Richard Matheson's story was involved in that, and
Yes.
other
Yes.
writers. Bloch and Matheson were good friends. They were contemporaries, both
Mhm.
born, well, Bloch was born in 1917, and Matheson about 9 years later, so they were
Okay.
contemporaries and knew each other, and um, liked each other. Um, and even I've told this story on another podcast about the Night Stalker and the Night Strangler. Matheson adapted an unpublished novel to create the TV movie The Night Stalker,
Hmm.
and produced by Dan Curtis, directed by John Llewellyn Moxey, and it was such a huge hit. It knocked Brian's song and Duel off the top of the
Oh,
ratings
wow.
chart. It became the highest rated made for TV movie and kept that title for a few years. But because it was such a smash success, ABC instantly wanted a sequel. And
Hmm.
so Matheson was charged with, well, what can I do? We've done a vampire. What can we do as a sequel? And he came up with the idea of, well, why don't I write about Jack the Ripper? But Matheson called Bloch and asked him and told him, I'd like to write about Jack the Ripper. What do you think about that? Because Matheson knew that Bloch was so connected and loved Ripperology and Jack the Ripper lore. And Matheson said, I could tell from something in his voice that Bob Bloch didn't liked that idea and didn't want me to do it. And so Matheson didn't. That was very kind and generous. Nobody
Hmm.
owns Jack the Ripper. Robert Bloch did
Right.
not own Jack the Ripper, so anyone could have written about him. And when Kolchak went into the series, Kolchak the Night Stalker, there
Hmm.
was a Ripper episode. But
Do
because
remember that.
Matheson was such friends with Bloch and didn't want to step on his literary toes, he chucked that idea and came up with a great idea about, someone who stays alive by draining blood every 21 years and all of that,
Yeah.
and that became the Night Strangler. But
Hmm.
but that was very interesting. I doubt that any writers or any businessmen or anybody today would be as considerate as that, but that's just the way
Yeah.
things were between them.
Hmm. Yeah, that shows the respect definitely that they had for each other. Absolutely.
Hmm. And and speaking again of Lovecraft, there was a nice paragraph in the autobiography. Well, there are dozens and dozens of pages in the autobiography about his friendship with Lovecraft and the letters and everything. But one nice paragraph is since his death more than a half century ago, now it's 90 years ago, Lovecraft and his work have been both revered and reviled. But two facts remain indisputable. Professionally, his influence on the field of supernatural horror fiction was equal to that of Edgar Allan Poe. Personally, he was one of the last true gentlemen. And Poe
Yeah,
scholars can debate that whether Lovecraft is Poe's equal or whether anyone on Earth is Poe's equal. But I know what he was saying. Lovecraft was the Edgar Allan Poe of the early 20th century, uh,
absolutely.
just
Hmm.
as Bloch, Matheson, Stephen King, Anne Rice, Clive Barker, all of the other great writers whom we read now continued
Absolutely.
that tradition, and but all of them owe their uh, works and their ideas and inspiration to Poe.
Hmm.
And when you had Mark DeWidziak on your podcast,
Hmm.
he said
Yeah.
something interesting. Mark DeWidziak is a fantastic expert on Poe, Twain, The
Hmm.
Night Stalker, Columbo, Dark Shadows, everything. But
Hmm.
Mark DeWidziak said, if you were to say to Poe's face, "You are a horror writer," he wouldn't know what you meant. He
Yeah.
just wouldn't know what those words meant, and if he figured it out, he would say that that's not what he was. He's not a horror writer. He would say, "I am a poet." But of
Absolutely.
course, now, we love the poetry, Annabel Lee and everything, but now we do often think of Edgar Allan Poe as the brilliant writer of the Telltale Heart, the scariest story ever written at that time, and still one of the scariest stories ever written. And
Hmm.
the Cask of Amontillado and the Mask of the Red Death and all of the horror stories. So yes, I think he sort of began that genre of horror writer along with Edgar Allan Poe. I mean, Robert Louis Stevenson and Oscar Wilde, and of course
Hmm.
Mary Shelley, 30 years or more before Poe. Um, so, but but yes, all of these writers have followed in the footsteps of Edgar Allan Poe, and all of them have built upon the ideas of what you were saying a moment ago, psychological terror. I
Hmm.
love the Telltale Heart. Nervous I am, but why do you think me mad? It's all about how he's crazy. He's an unreliable narrator. We don't know whether to believe him or not, and I'm sure he's not giving us the facts. I doubt that the heart was really beating still under the floorboards, but it was beating in his mind and in his
Absolutely.
ears, and probably he's sitting in an insane asylum at the moment that he is telling us this story. Uh,
Hmm.
so uh,
Yeah, I always think about Psycho and just the madness and things that were written about Norman Bates. I always kind of connect the Telltale Heart to that just because of the same psychology used and just the word mad and things like that.
oh yes, right, yeah. Um, Psychological horror,
Hmm.
and Matheson and other writers have sort of given us their definitions, or the difference between terror and horror. They say that terror is more physical and visceral. The monster is right there on you, and
Yeah,
you're about to be killed, and you're terrified. Horror is more in your mind. It's your thoughts of
yeah,
what's going to happen to me, what's the worst case scenario, what is about to happen, what's behind that door. And so that's horror, whereas the actual violence and the mayhem would be terror.
yeah. That's an interesting way to think about it. I had never thought of it like that. Definitely. Now, Dr. Jeff, have you ever taught one of Robert Bloch's stories
Uh,
before?
yes, I often would read aloud to my students at TSU a story he wrote called "Till Death Do Us Part,"
Okay.
um, which is a murder story. A man kills his wife and devises a perfect crime and a way that he will definitely get away with it. It's foolproof until
Hmm.
at the end, of course, it blows up in his face. And as with many of Bloch's stories, the last few sentences have some sort of shock or surprise or punch to them.
Okay.
And so yeah, I shared that with my students till death do us part. And
Mhm.
um, but no, I haven't necessarily taught outright one of his stories the way I
Okay.
do always teach Annabelle Lee. We
Hmm.
go over that and do a close reading and decide whether that narrator is reliable or unreliable. Did she love
Yes.
him? Was her whole point of living to love and be loved by him? That sounds like a kind of extreme, and maybe
Yes.
that's his interpretation of it, but I imagine that there's more to her life than just loving him. So, I
Hmm.
think that's an unreliable narrator. But
Yeah.
and and then whenever I taught honors world literature, we had the Pit and the Pendulum in our and the Cask of Amontillado in
Okay.
our book.
Hmm.
The one was the Norton anthology and one was the Longman anthology. And so we
Okay.
did those.
Yes.
And I often showed all or segments of Vincent Price's great one-man show, An Evening of Edgar Allan Poe, that he
Hmm.
did in the early 70s. It's a 52-minute TV special, and it's a one-man show with costumes and a few props and a little bit of walking around, but mostly it's just the verbatim recitation of the Telltale Heart, the Pit and the Pendulum, the Sphinx, and one or two others.
Can't remember. I found it and watched it a couple years ago. Oh, it's so good.
Yes, it is.
It's so well done.
And um, and Jonathan Frid, Barnabas Collins on Dark Shadows,
Hmm.
did a series of one-man shows of dramatic readings in which he read Shakespeare and Stephen King and Irwin Shaw and Eve Merriam, and he sometimes read The Telltale Heart, and did it for a chain of PBS stations in New Jersey in the 1980s. The group of PBS stations in New Jersey was called the New Jersey Network, and Dark
Okay.
Shadows aired every night uninterrupted on the New Jersey Network in the 1980s. And so at one of
Mhm.
those fundraisers, you've seen those on our own Channel 8 here in
Mhm.
Nashville, where people
Yeah.
talk and people answer the phone and they have little skits and features. And so one of them was a pre-recorded recitation by Jonathan Frid of The Telltale Heart.
Oh,
So
nice.
that he did a great job, and that is what inspired me to read it aloud to my students many
Okay.
times. For many years at TSU, I did a Halloween presentation, on the
Fun.
on the day, or usually a day or two before Halloween. It was like an assembly, and I showed clips from Blackula, Suspiria, Night of the Living Dead, and other movies, and maybe a clip of Sir Cecil Creep, Nashville's TV horror host, and
Mhm.
things like that, and then read aloud some stories like The Metronome by August Derleth, and
Mhm.
well, Prey, Prey,
Mhm.
Richard Matheson's Zuni doll story that became
Oh, yes.
Amelia in Trilogy of Terror, and The Telltale Heart, which was always a big hit. Poe was so ahead of his time. He was 19th century, and yet he was 20th century in terms of his subject
Mhm.
matter and the way he put his ideas across in a more modern way very often, because we're dealing with abnormal psychology and sociology and things that had not really come into the mainstream yet. Yeah, I think that's why Poe has such great staying power because he's not dated. He's not
Absolutely. Mhm.
an overly flowery 18th century writer, and you have to look up every other word, but he writes in a 19th century manner with great vocabulary that you do have to look up, but it's more accessible than other writers of his time or previous to him.
Absolutely. So one question I had is, did Robert Bloch have a preference of what like genre he wrote in? Or did he just kind of like, I guess maybe the mood of how he was feeling, that's what he would write, or
I'm
what job would come available? I mean, because sometimes for writers, that's the bottom line sometimes.
Yes, right. When, he got hired to write an episode of The Girl from U.N.C.L.E., so he wrote in
Yes.
that tongue-in-cheek spy manner
Mhm.
of the 1960s, or Star Trek, or Alfred Hitchcock, or this or that. But no,
Yeah.
I think that he enjoyed all fantastic fiction, and some
Mhm.
of his work is straight crime drama. There's nothing supernatural or otherworldly about it.
Mhm.
But many of his stories deal with science fiction, or fantasy or horror. So
Mhm.
I think that he just liked all of those way out, weird, wild, shocking ideas, and
Mhm.
that is what he enjoyed writing the most. But
Okay.
definitely crime. American Gothic is essentially a crime novel, and so is The Kidnapper.
Mm.
But then there are other stories of his that, of course, are science fiction. They involve rocket ships and other planets and things like
Mhm.
that. The Goddess of Wisdom is one of those, and
Okay.
then others are definitely horror. Maybe not supernatural horror, although a lot of them are. The Skull of the
Mhm.
Marquis de Sade and things like
Mhm.
that. Psycho is not supernatural. Everything in Psycho could really happen,
Happen.
and
Mhm.
has perhaps in from time to time, but
Mhm.
there was another story. What is the story that we talked about in our get together a few months ago? The story about the man who visits the insane asylum. what was the name of that story?
Oh, the system of Dr. Tar and
Oh,
Professor
yeah, right.
Feather.
Yeah, the
Yeah.
system of Dr. Carr and Professor Feather. Yeah, the Alan Parsons Project did a song about that on
Oh,
its
yes, yes.
album Tales of Mystery and Imagination. But I
Mhm.
mentioned that because in 1961, Mr. Bloch wrote a story called A Home Away from Home. And 2 years
Oh,
later, it became an episode of the Alfred Hitchcock Hour, fleshed out and with more characters and events because this was a short story. And by then, the Alfred Hitchcock Hour was an hour-long show, not 30 minutes. But
mm.
Bloch readily admits that I borrowed Poe's idea of the inmates taking over the asylum. He says that in his book.
Oh, that's
Because
cool.
A Home Away from Home is a similar story about a young lady who goes to visit her uncle, whom she has never met before because she's been living in Australia, and she goes to England to visit him after her parents die. And he's the head doctor, the director of the insane asylum, the sanitarium, or whatever
Okay.
you want to call it. And
Yeah.
once she gets there, she meets unusual characters, very, very similar to Poe's story. So there are quite a few echoes of Poe in Robert Bloch, of
Hmm.
course.
Absolutely. Jeannie, what are you thinking of any thoughts or questions?
I'm just enjoying the talk.
I know.
I'm learning more by listening, so I'm
I
like,
know.
whoa.
Oh, I know it. Well, and one other thing I wanted to bring up, we did, I think was it last season, Jeannie, or the season before? We did our talk about H.P. Lovecraft, and one of the things that we learned was just that he was a man of letters, like he called himself that.
Oh,
And
yeah.
Yeah.
so for Robert Bloch to write to him, and then you and he exchanged letters. I mean, it's like, men of letters. It's just really neat, just carrying on that tradition because it's so lost now.
Well,
Oh
isn't it
yes, yeah. I,
true
I
that
I love writing letters and still have a couple of pen pals.
Hmm.
Back in the 1980s when I was involved heavily with Dark Shadows fandom and the festivals, I
Hmm.
was pen pals with 3 dozen people all over the
Oh,
country
wow.
and wrote letters all the time. But now, obviously, instead we write emails or we write to each other on Facebook or something
Yeah.
like that, text or whatever. But yeah, I love to write letters and still do. And well, I sent you all my Christmas letter.
Yes.
hmm
Yes.
Some years for the holidays I send a photo, and some years a regular holiday card. But then the
Mhm.
last couple of years I've written a letter telling you what my family and I have been doing. So yeah, I
Yeah.
love writing letters, and H.P. Lovecraft was a voracious letter writer.
Hmm.
Some of his biographers have said it's a shame he wrote that many letters because it took him away from writing stories. But who can judge that? Anyone's letters show a great deal about him or her and his or her
Absolutely.
thoughts and
Mhm.
life experiences and events and happiness and sadness and things. So they're almost like little stories. They aren't stories. They are little
Yeah.
bits of autobiographical stories. So
Hmm.
yeah, many of the writers of the early 20th century and of course the 19th century,
Hmm.
many writers' letters have been collected into books that are thicker than their fiction sometimes,
That's true.
So, so yeah, so it's nice that people take the time to sit down and write their thoughts. It is a vanishing art, sadly, in our modern fast-paced world of texts and
Absolutely.
tweets and emails and social media blasts and things like that, which are all wonderful. That's a great way to communicate
Yeah.
quickly and expediently, but it's nice to flesh out your thoughts and write some things
Hmm.
down from time to time.
Absolutely.
Um, and the one thing that was great about writing letters, because I had a pen pal myself who was German when I was young in school. One of my teachers, think it was sixth grade, she started this program because she was working with another teacher in Germany.
Mhm.
And so, and it, to me, I was I was learning about another culture. I was learning about another person that I knew I'd probably never meet in person.
Mhm.
Uh, and this person, Sonia, was actually sending me words that were German, and she was like writing a little cheat sheet of, teaching me German and writing, and I was like, this is wonderful. And I also think that one of the things that writing has become a lost art is, to me, writing is a true form. It's a true form of ourselves, because most of the time when we write, we're putting part of who we are on that paper. And
Yes.
it's not like when you text something or you write something on electronic or you video something. It's more of an internal, to me,
Mhm.
that's why when I write a letter to someone, it's very personal, and it's very much a part of who I am that I'm sharing with somebody, that you're important enough to me. So I
Yeah.
think that was great that Robert Bloch and Lovecraft, and then didn't Poe and Dickens have write letters to each other and stuff too?
I
As
believe so,
pen,
yes.
yeah.
Think
So
so. Yes.
so I think that's just great, and yeah, it is very much a lost art form that, just like in today's society, they're trying to find people that know how to read cursive to work for the Library of Congress,
Yeah.
Right, yes. Uh-huh.
because they need someone to help translate the new things they're uncovering back from the
Mhm.
days of where there was no print. There was all cursive.
Hmm.
Yeah,
So,
that is
um,
true.
now that would be an interesting horror story to write.
Yes.
you know,
Mhm.
have someone in the modern times be lost in the past, where they had to figure out how to get home, but they had to read some stuff and they couldn't read it because they couldn't read cursive.
Right,
All
yes.
right,
I'm like,
Judy, you
what?
gotta we've tasked you now. You've got to write that story.
Oh
Hmm.
no, I shouldn't have said anything, but all
Yeah.
right.
Ah,
That would be like another Psycho. That would be like, woo, okay.
Hmm. Yeah,
Or
I
no,
like,
what's the Twilight Zone one that we were talking about? Oh, where he's like, uh his glasses broke and he's
yeah,
surrounded by all these
time
books.
enough at last.
Yes,
Burgess
yes,
that one.
Meredith.
yes, yeah,
Hmm.
Yes. There, Burgess Meredith, yes.
Hmm.
yes,
So yeah,
Okay.
that would be like the most horror filled to me if that
Hmm.
happened to me. But
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, I like what you said about writing to someone in another country,
Hmm.
because people need to be aware of other cultures and
Yeah.
other parts of the world. Um, even if you've never left Tennessee or never left your state,
Mm-hmm.
you need to have knowledge of other people and other ways of living, that builds
Absolutely.
empathy. I was talking to a friend last night and said, I've always said that two very, very important parts of anybody's education or life experience are travel and being in a play.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah.
Either on stage or backstage, definitely try to be in some sort of play because that is all of life in a microcosm.
Hmm.
Everything good and bad. You're going to make friends for life or you're going to make enemies. Hopefully not,
Yep.
but one
Yeah.
or the other because all of you are so concentrated and pushed together in a pressure cooker, of trying to make sense of this play and get it out on the stage and work the lights and work together, collaborate and
Mhm.
learn how to deal with people, negotiate and live with people. So that's
True.
why I think everyone should be in some sort of formal presentation like that, some sort of play or opera or
Mhm.
something, because that
Yeah.
really teaches you about life and people and teaches you about yourself, all of the good things about yourself and the things you ought to improve about yourself. And then the
Yeah.
other thing, of course, is travel. There's no substitute for that. Just going to a different place, even if it's for us as close as Chattanooga or
Mm-hmm.
York or Arizona or Jamaica or, you know, Canada or anywhere, just going to a different place and seeing different sights and meeting different people and listening to them talk and
Yeah.
watching how they live and work and everything, and that broadens your mind and your life experience, and you got a little taste of that when you were writing to the lady
Yeah.
in Germany.
Um,
Yeah.
When I was a teenager, I think I wrote briefly to a guy in Jamaica, and then
Ooh, cool.
uh, was thrilled to visit Jamaica in 1983 with my parents and sister, and then 25 years later, in 2008, with my parents and sister and her husband, and now five children. And
Ooh.
so
oh, Kate.
I definitely, I've told my son Jonathan, I want to go back to Jamaica in 2033. Another 25 years will have passed,
Yeah.
and go with him and my 1-year-old grandson Jackson. And
Uh-huh.
now
Oh.
those five little kids, my nieces and nephews, are now in their 20s and 30s, and now we have five new little kids. I have four great nieces and a great nephew.
Oh, that's
But
awesome.
the thing to do if you ever go to Jamaica, Montego Bay, which is up on the northern shore,
Mm-hmm.
is to go just a little ways away from Montego Bay to the town of Ocho Rios and climb Dunn's River Falls.
Oh,
Dunn's,
wow.
Dunn's River Falls. It's a natural waterfall that
Hmm.
falls down onto the beach and into the ocean.
Oh,
And
wow.
Nice.
but it's naturally stair stepped. It's
Okay.
shallow water. It's never more than up to your calves, sometimes just your ankles. But
Hmm.
people hold hands, and climb up the falls,
Yeah.
and with all of the lush vegetation on both sides and that wonderful sound of the water falling down, and it's so refreshing. It's fresh water, from a creek or a river. Well, a river, Dunn's River, that falls into the ocean. And if you've seen the James Bond movie Doctor No, uh,
Yes.
that's Dunn's River Falls.
Okay.
That's it.
Okay. Yeah.
And you see it again in the James Coburn spy movie Our Man Flint, and I think briefly
It's been a
in the
long
James
time.
Bond movie Live and Let Die. But yeah, you
Okay.
get a good shot of it in Doctor No and that Flint movie. But yeah, if
Okay.
you ever go to Jamaica, climb Dunn's River Falls, and anybody can do it, just hold hands and wear some sort of water shoes, but
Okay.
you never get more than up to your calves or hips, if that even. But I told Jonathan I want us to go back and climb Dunn's River Falls again in 2033, so I will have done it every 25 years.
That's a
Nice.
neat goal to set. Yeah. Oh,
And it's good to have those things
yes.
to have
Absolutely.
to share with some people that's part
Hmm.
of your own history. And that's the one thing that I do regret about with Sonia is I tried to stay connected to her even through high school because we started, you know, uh, communicating, corresponding when I was in sixth grade, and I every like holiday or I tried to keep writing even into college,
Hmm.
but it's like we separated and we got lost because she moved away and then I moved away and then we just lost touch and
Hmm.
that would be one of the wonderful things because the irony of it is one of the very first people that I got to meet from another country was two friends that I had made that were German, and we
Oh,
met in Vancouver, Canada.
Mm.
wow.
Through, because we were, we had started corresponding and we had met online, and then we were all going to this convention in Vancouver, and we met up, and I'm like, this is great. My very first pen pal was German, and then the very first people I meet from out of, from another country. Now, I won't count Canada, but I'd been to Mexico and Canada. But to me, they're attached to us, so it's not really
Right,
another
right.
country. So, but it was just so great, and I kept thinking to myself, wouldn't it have been wonderful if I'd gotten to meet Sonia?
Mhm.
And so maybe someday, some way, I would, if she perhaps may be listening,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
remember me. So,
Oh,
you never know, but that would be. And I love how Lovecraft and Bloch got that. So Bloch and himself, to me, that was his little, he got to be a fan, but he also was a fandom of his own type of
yeah.
thing.
Oh, yeah. Hmm.
Hmm.
So uh
Absolutely.
it's just amazing how those little tidbits connect through the world, and
Yeah.
how, Poe and Dickens, and then Poe to Lovecraft, and Lovecraft to Bloch. uh so,
I know.
that's one of the reasons why we have the 6 degrees of Poe, because they just keep going.
You
Right. Hmm.
need to make like a flow chart.
Oh no, 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 I don't have enough yarn or time for that.
Oh, we do a digital one.
Exactly.
Oh, oh, yeah. You can bring in Horace Walpole and uh, Joseph Sheridan Le Fanu and
Oh yeah.
Mm-hmm.
well, everything. Beowulf is science
Oh,
fiction,
absolutely.
fantasy, and horror.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh,
Grendel was one of my
really good.
favorites. I love Grendel.
Oh,
Hmm.
yeah. You've read John Gardner's book Grendel.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, which tells the story of Beowulf from the point of view of Grendel.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. That's, that was one of the things that when I first started teaching freshman English, Beowulf was one of the readings that we had. And I knew that they would hate it because it was in a language that, you know, but like you were saying, Dr. Jeff, is everybody needs to put themselves into a play, or, to experience that. And so that's what I would tell the kids. I'm like, yes, it's a poem, but if you like portray yourself as you're actually being in it,
Hmm.
then you become it. So I tried to make all the readings like a play,
Right.
so
Yeah.
they could experience what was happening, like how it felt to be hunted, how it felt to hunt, how it felt to be, you know, to be seen as a monster, even though you might have been a monster, but maybe the monster wasn't truly a monster. It just looked that way. So it's all about perception.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
it, I love, Iliad and the Odyssey, and, Jason and the Argonauts. And I would
Mhm.
always have so much fun with with those and the mythology, and
Yeah.
because it would be like, you can't go just based on what you perceive something when you see it. Just
Mhm.
because it may not fit your idea of beauty doesn't make it bad. You
Yeah.
know, just because something may look hideous in your eyes doesn't mean that that's what's inside them, that they're going to be hideous.
Right. Hmm.
So, and like I was telling Carmen when I was doing a little bit of reading about Robert Bloch, and when Hitchcock got the rights to turn Psycho, the book, into the movie, that one of
Hmm.
the things they discussed was not making Norman Bates look like a common, next door, you know, person,
Yeah.
like the serial killer. Well, he killed two people. I can't remember what his name was, Tim something. The one that was based on Wisconsin. It was happening
Well, Ed
when,
Gein.
yeah, Ed Dean. Well, I don't know why I
Ed
keep
Gein.
calling him
Yeah,
Tim.
Gein.
Yeah.
Ed Gein.
Yeah.
Mhm.
who lived near Robert Bloch.
Yes.
Bloch knew about that just from the town gossip, and
Yes.
that's what
Mhm.
partially gave him the idea to write Psycho. Yeah.
Mhm.
Exactly. And that's why when they were discussing uh, Norman Bates's character, they decided to make him more uh, not more Hollywood than just
Mhm.
the guy next door,
Mhm.
like the Ed guy, because I don't know if it was Hitchcock or if it's Block or if it may have been the person I was reading that was wrote it, that they
Mhm.
thought that, oh, you stick somebody that looks just normal, everybody's going to know he's the killer right away. You know, it's not going to leave it with any kind of surprise. Everybody's going like, yeah, he did it. You know,
Oh
so
goodness.
I'm like, yeah, well, but and someone like Norman Bates, oh no, he's too nice, he's too cute,
Mhm.
he couldn't do that. You're right.
Yeah.
But
In the novel, um, the character of Norman Bates is not young, tall, slender, nice
mm-mm,
looking like Anthony
Mhm.
Perkins. He's more middle aged and pudgy, you know.
yep,
So that was a big change. Joseph Stefano is the one who wrote the screen adaptation of
screenwrite, yeah.
Psycho, and then later he worked on the Outer Limits, the great TV show. But yeah, that was a change, um, and in the novel, Marion Crane's name is Mary Crane for some
Mm-hmm.
reason. And in the shower scene, uh, as Bloch writes it, the killer cuts off her head. He doesn't
That's
just
right.
stab her. The last sentence of the chapter is something just as simple, as sparse as, and cut off her head.
Mm-hmm.
Robert Bloch liked to make understatements like that, just
Yeah.
drop that in as if that was just matter
Normal.
of
Yeah.
fact. Yeah. Uh,
Mhm.
but um, but of course that didn't make it into Psycho, and probably could not possibly have in 1960, and wasn't necessary because that shower scene is the scariest thing that people had seen up until that time.
Oh
And
yeah.
you're right, Jeannie. When I have taught um, stories, poems, novels, movies to my students, I try to stress on them to, as what you said, put themselves back into that time. Think about the readers of that time and how shocked they would have been by
Mhm.
this. Back then they had not seen The Conjuring and Insidious and all of those movies. So The Telltale Heart was the most shocking, horrific thing they'd ever seen. Or back then they had not seen Avatar and Interstellar and all of this. So this description of nature or the sky was to them like their avatar. It was something wondrous that they read and pictured in their minds. And that's where people were at that point in history. They hadn't seen everything we had seen. So this was new and surprising and shocking or pleasing or happy or whatever to them.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think and unfortunately, I mean, I love that we have grown, with our stories, with our cinema and everything. But at the same time, I think a lot of that has been lost because we're apathetic now to the point to where, oh, yay,
Mhm.
look, it's another horror story. I think they're coming out with a Scream 7 now, and I'm going,
Yeah, I think so.
what?
Yeah, it's in theaters already. Yeah, Scream 7. Mhm.
Mhm.
I'm like, um, didn't they all die? I'm like, eh. It's like Final Destination. Now, Final Destination, I will have to say, the first one was that pop of like, woo, that's something we haven't had in a while, you
Mhm.
know. And I love how even the memes now where
Oh, yeah.
they show if you're falling behind a log truck and everybody's
Mhm.
like backing up, and everybody's like, if you don't, then you didn't grow up with what we did. you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, the Final Destination movies, especially the first and fifth, are very, very clever. And this new
Hmm.
sixth one that came out a year ago, Final Destination Bloodlines, is really
Mhm.
Really?
something. That's worth seeing.
Oh,
It's different from the others. It's clever, and it's a horror movie that is actually scary. And
Oh,
I might
and
have to look it
to
up.
me, it's realistic in the sense of, uh, I'm probably never going to be chased by Freddy and Jason and murdered by them, but
No.
right.
the threat in the Final Destination movies is something very, very real,
Hmm.
death that is
Hmm.
coming for all of us, and that's
Hmm.
scary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes.
I don't think I watched it after the first one because it was like, oh, well, and then because I think that was back then, because I never, okay, I'm gonna admit this, and I will deny it if anybody asks me. I have never seen Friday the 13th. Never.
Mhm.
And because just the thought of somebody with a hockey mask killing people, I'm going, all right, because there was all about the same time. You had Mike Myers, you had, Freddy Krueger. So it was just one of those things. Now, I watched Nightmare on Elm Street when I was 10 years old.
Mhm.
Okay. And it was the late movies. That was back when they showed the movies after midnight. You
Mhm.
know, I probably shouldn't have been watching it. My parents didn't know I was awake. But anyway, so and I'd watched Halloween. And so just the thought of watching Friday the 13th, because I was like, what these these weren't really, I liked more the idea behind Nightmare on Elm Street than I actually liked the movie because the
Mhm.
basis of Nightmare on Elm Street had a little bit of truth to it because it was based off of a child molester, that was a killer, and they ended up executing him. So the realness behind the story kind of is what got me more than the actual Nightmare on Elm Street,
Mhm.
thinking about somebody. I was more afraid of somebody grabbing me under my bed when I was awake than I was when I was asleep. I had no problems dreaming. So,
Yeah.
uh, so
And there again, in the late 70s and early 80s, Halloween, Friday the 13th, all of that
mhm,
was the scariest things we had ever seen because up
Mhm.
exactly.
until then, except Texas Chainsaw Massacre and a few other movies, up until
Hmm.
then, our idea of horror was Universal horror, Hammer horror,
Yes,
and the Roger Corman, Vincent Price Poe movies. That
exactly.
that was horror. But of course, Last House on the Left and Texas Chainsaw Massacre and
Hmm.
Halloween and all of those came
Mhm.
on, and Night of the Living Dead, and upped the ante of horror.
Yeah, Children
Mhm.
of the Corn and all that.
Yeah.
So yeah, it just and then unfortunately to me, a lot of it became so trope that it was like, I the movie Urban Legends. Have you ever heard of that one?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. Mhm.
Oh yeah. I almost got kicked out of the theater.
Why, were you talking or what?
Well, it was just it's like it was so predictable. And I wasn't being very loud, but the place was packed. So I'm sitting here and my friends made me go. It was one of those things because I told them I really don't want to go, but they're like, "Oh no, you'll love it. Let's go." And people sometimes don't listen. So I'm sitting there and the whole thing of where I would just say, I'm like, don't go behind that door, you know, don't, that dude's gonna die, you know. It got to and apparently
Be
either
brave.
the woman in front of the girl in front of me or somebody got, because I mean, I wasn't trying to be loud. It wasn't like I was, yelling it across thing. I was
Mhm.
just saying it before it happened. So the usher came over and he was just like, "Would you please, keep your comments to yourself?" And or I'm gonna have to ask you to leave. And I'm like, okay. So, but it was like, yeah, I was like, I didn't realize I was being that loud, but it was just so trope. It just And that's one of the reasons why I have a problem with watching horror movies, because when people mark them as horror, I'm going, yeah, no. If you can sit there and predict exactly who's going to die, when they're going to die, what's going to happen before anything, it's not a horror movie to me. And it's like when we talk in Poe Unplugged. Poe had the right of it. It was all about build up, and it was all about things that we hadn't seen before, things we hadn't experienced. Like Telltale Heart, it talks about someone being dismembered, but
Hmm.
Yeah.
you don't concentrate on the person being dismembered. You're so invested in the narrator that's doing the dismembering, and
Hmm.
it's the psychological toll that it's taking on them with hearing the heartbeat and all that kind of stuff. So you just kind of don't even focus on the person, the poor old man with the blue eye that's no more and chopped up in little pieces. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, and I think a lot of it has to deal with how we were built to understand horror and to have that connection with horror. And like you said, in the time in 1960, Psycho was the ultimate, because, and we have
Yeah.
to give props to Alfred Hitchcock, because the man knew how to use cinematography and sound,
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
and everything to add that to it. Because Robert Bloch had written the story, but Alfred Hitchcock was the one that turned it into a century masterpiece
Oh, yeah.
Hmm.
to build the idea. Because even now, the that we all hear, we automatically, boom, it goes to Psycho. So
Yeah. Bernard Herrmann, great
exactly.
music.
Hmm.
Hmm.
Yeah. Hitchcock said that if you're watching a movie and the sound goes off, you ought to be able to continue to understand what is happening because
Yes.
films
Yeah.
are visual and they don't tell you, they're supposed to show you. So even if the sound goes haywire, if you just keep watching, you should get some sort of idea of what's happening. And sure enough, Psycho is so visual, the
Hmm.
private investigator going up the stairs and the
Oh, yeah.
shocking sight in the fruit cellar and of course the shower scene. But um, there are parts of Psycho that are almost like a silent movie. That long scene when Norman is cleaning up the mess after Mother has killed someone. There's
Yeah.
no talking. Great music by Bernard Herrmann, but it's all visual. We're watching Norman clean up that horror and becoming we sympathize with him. That's when we really build our sympathy and even love for him. And then later we find out the whole story. But yeah, so you're right. All of Hitchcock's movies, any great director's movies, any of them should be
Mhm.
visual and
Yeah.
paint pictures on the screen and show us rather than just tell us, like a radio drama has to just tell us.
Mhm.
Um,
Oh yes. But
Absolutely.
even with radio dramas, they would use the sound effects
oh yes, uh-huh.
to
Mhm.
help build that sensory. And did I read somewhere that Robert actually had written his own radio drama, or was a
Yes.
part of a radio
Yeah,
drama?
he had his own radio show. I think it was called Stay Tuned for Terror.
Yes, yes.
Um,
Stay tuned
and
for
it
terror.
ran, I think, 13 episodes or 26. But sadly, I don't think any of them still exist, or maybe,
No.
Oh.
but at the time that he wrote his book, he said that
Mhm.
that none of the tapes still exist, so many things.
Right.
So many radio shows, TV shows, daytime shows especially, even the Tonight Show,
Mhm.
Yeah.
were not kept. The tapes were erased and reused, because
Yep.
people didn't realize that this is history and this is significant culture and had
Yeah.
no idea that it would ever be rerun. Who would ever want to watch something a second time? But of
Oh yeah.
course,
Or
that's
a
what
third
we
or a
do.
fourth.
Yeah.
Yeah.
or want to keep a copy for themselves
Yes,
because
right.
True.
I
That is
mean,
true.
I know I have my favorite copies of old shows and stuff, and
Mhm.
I know Carmen does, and behind Dr. Jeff's head, you can see on his bookcase the cool stuff that he loves, like his Dark Shadows and stuff.
Mhm.
And I think to me that is our way of paying homage to like Robert Bloch and to all those that came before him and all those that are going to come after him,
Yeah.
to keep that part alive so it can inspire the future. Like, with in Carmen's classes and what used to be my classes, since I can't teach anymore. And Dr. Jeff, you're still doing adjunct, correctly?
Oh, yeah, at TSU and Nashville State. But all of us are
Yeah.
still teaching. You're still teaching because you're
Yeah.
talking here on this podcast. So all of us are imparting our knowledge and our
Yeah.
opinions and feelings, to other
Absolutely.
Yeah.
people. So we're teaching.
Mhm.
Yeah. So I think that is our way of keeping their love alive and their talent and their inspiration to us. And I
Mhm.
think that's unfortunately a lot of people don't understand that when I explain to them how I have uh, love for Edgar Allan Poe, because they're like, didn't he just write poems? And I'm like, oh no.
Oh.
So, and then, but it's like, no. And I mean, it's not everybody's cup of tea. Not everybody is a Psycho fan, which I don't know, understand how they can't be, but uh, to each his own. Not everybody likes horror movies. My mom never liked horror movies. She would
Mhm.
not watch them. Um, she wasn't a musical fan or anything like that. So, my love of musicals came from my grandmother, and this was a shock for me. I remember I was staying with her one day, and she's like, "Okay, we're going to watch my favorite show. We're going to watch my favorite movie." And I'm like, oh, "Okay." I thought it might have been something, like Breakfast at Tiffany's or something like that.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden, the Sound of Music starts
Oh,
playing.
yes.
And I'm going,
Magnificent.
what is this? I'd never seen the Sound of Music or heard anything about the Sound of Music, but it was ever since that day that I fell in love with musicals.
Yeah.
Like the
Mm.
Sound of Music and then My Fair Lady and all of those. And it was all from my grandmother. And it was the one person that I would never have thought, because
Yeah.
I never saw her read anything. I never saw her with books or anything like that. But she did. She had them all, but they were all hidden in her bedroom. But we weren't allowed to go in there. And now I understood why, is because she protected them so much that she didn't want anybody else to know.
Mhm.
And for
Yeah.
her to share something like that with me was so important. And to know uh, that people are hiding things, and sometimes the things they hide shouldn't be hidden.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, how many more of her own children didn't even know that she had this love, because she didn't want to share it because she didn't want to seem, I don't know, she was afraid. You know how
Yeah.
sometimes we get afraid of people are going to think differently of us or see us differently with the things that we like or the things that we read.
Mhm.
So I just hope that's one of the things with our podcast and everything, that people know that it's okay to have obsessions with writers, with
Mhm.
movies, with those, as long as you don't go a little too far like Psycho. You know,
Yeah, right.
don't take that obsession way out there, but
Oh.
but it's good to have those loves. It's good to have those connections, because I know every one of the connections that I've had with all the books and all the people has to deal with something that has connected on a deeper level with me. That somebody is seeing something of me that I have not shared with anyone, that I don't have to verbally, because they can understand me from another level.
Yeah.
And I think that's what Poe does for me, and I'm glad that there are other people that have those things they can share with others.
Yeah,
So,
I
okay, my
agree.
psycho moment's over.
All right. Your psycho monologue.
Yeah, my psycho monologue is done.
Oh, well, any last thoughts on Robert Bloch?
No, I think I've got all I've got. Dr. Jeff, how about you?
Yeah, just read some of his short stories. There are 3 volumes called The Collected Short Stories of Robert Bloch, and
Hmm.
each one is different. It might end up being just crime, or it might be supernatural, or it's science fiction, or
Hmm.
it's serial killers or Jack the Ripper, or it's split personality, or it's something that builds up to a twist ending that's either scary or funny. He wrote
Hmm.
a lot of funny stories too, with a
Yeah.
character named Lefty Feep. Uh,
Oh,
so, um, so yeah, just read some of his short stories and see what you think, because they're not old-timey, they're not inaccessible. They still, pack a punch and entertain us today.
Good.
okay. Well,
Yep.
and just the more I've learned about him, just doing a little research, listen to what you taught us tonight, Dr. Jeff, he was very much like Poe with the different styles of writing that he did, and just just being a very nice, funny human too, as well.
Hmm.
So that's
Yep.
really a neat connection.
Yep.
Well, I guess on that
On that note, we are
po
oh,
Oh, out.
January 1st, 1796. This day, my first on the lighthouse, I make this entry in my diary as I agreed on with the Grot. As regularly as I can keep the journal, I will, but there is no telling what may happen to a man all alone as I am. I may get sick or worse.